Hey, I'm Tyler Newman, and in this video, we're going to talk about how to find and identify profitable property development opportunities, as well as figuring out what the land is worth and how to therefore calculate your offer. So the first thing you need to understand is the difference between acquiring a site with planning permission in place already versus finding sites that don't have planning permission and taking them through planning yourselves. So of course, there is no right or wrong way to do it, and you can absolutely make both work. But it's important to understand when it comes to acquiring sites that have planning permission in place already, there's some pros and cons you need to be aware of. So the benefit of acquiring a site that has planning permission in place already means that you can start construction pretty much straight away. If the planning's been approved, all you have to do is discharge any pre-commencement conditions that the council have outlined, and then you're able to start with the construction. The only downside is that one, you're often building out a scheme that someone else has designed and got planning for. And secondly, you've missed out on the opportunity to add value to the land and create profit by taking it through planning yourself. If you're buying a site that has planning permission in place already, it's likely whoever's taken that through planning has made a profit and added value to the land by doing that process. On the other hand, if you're going out and finding sites that don't have planning permission in place already, and you take those sites through planning yourself and you take on the risk of planning and you invest the money in the planning, that process of obtaining planning permission is going to add significant value to the land. And so that added value and that uplift in value in the land is essentially just more profit in the deal for you. And that's why for some, their sole strategy is just finding land without planning, obtaining the planning permission, and then selling it on for a profit to another developer and not getting involved in any of the construction. And so when it comes to finding opportunities, you can either look at opportunities that are on market or look for opportunities off market and negotiate directly with the landowner. Now, looking for and finding opportunities that are advertised on the market and on the public domain, for example, on property portals like Rightmove or with land agents, the problem is you're competing with other people. You're competing with other developers that are cash rich and don't have the same finance costs as you, therefore allowing them to pay more for the land. You're also competing with developers that are also construction companies and can build out the scheme for a lot cheaper than you can, again, therefore allowing them to offer more for the land. And this is the main problem with looking at sites that are on the market. You're competing with everybody else and you're looking where everybody else is looking. And so really the best way to consistently find the better and more profitable opportunities is by looking off market. Now, there are many ways to search for opportunities off market. One is using mapping softwares like Nimbus or Land Insight. Secondly, you can look at planning permission data and look at all of the planning applications in an area and write to these landowners that are taking their sites through planning, expressing your interest in the land before maybe they advertise it on the open market. And thirdly, by simply just driving around and walking around as you're going about your life, you can look for opportunities that you can then approach. And it's amazing once you begin to actually look for these opportunities when you're driving around, how many opportunities you can actually spot. And so a question for you guys watching is, how many times have you driven to and from work maybe, or a different destination, and you've driven the same route over and over again for maybe years at a time, and then one day you suddenly seen some houses being built on a small plot that you had no idea was there. And all that time you were passing that opportunity, but never once thought to approach it. And so once you begin to understand the planning principles and what determines whether a parcel of land has opportunity for development, you'll quickly begin to see more and more opportunities in your everyday life. And so out of those methods, I believe the best way to predictably and consistently find new opportunities is using mapping softwares. Simply put, these mapping softwares are just like Google Maps with a few extra layers and tools that allow you to make certain checks and pull up certain information that help you as a developer. And you can use these tools to identify parcels of land that you think have precedent for development. And once you've identified various opportunities using these mapping softwares, you simply download the title register documents to find out who the owner or proprietor is of the land. You can input their details into a spreadsheet. mail merge that into some letters and send the letters out to the landowners registering your interest in their land and explain that you're a developer and be interested in having a conversation with them. Now you can systemize this using virtual assistants, for example, and you're going to want to follow up with these landowners after 1 month, 6 months, and then every 12 months. But if you do enough volume, it's going to generate enough inquiries, and enough conversations are of course going to lead into offers, and enough offers will eventually lead into a deal. So let's say you've approached a landowner who has some land that's a viable development opportunity. How do you actually go about figuring out what you can offer for the land? And how do you go about actually structuring the deal? Well, when it comes to structuring a deal, I want to introduce you to an agreement called an option contract. An option contract gives you the option, but not the obligation, to purchase a piece of land at an agreed price by an agreed date in the future. Now, as with any contract, there are lots of different clauses and amendments you can make to it. But what an option contract allows you to do is take legal control over a property. By entering an option agreement with a landowner, this gives you legal control over the property, as well as the option to buy it at a certain price by a certain time in the future. And what this allows you to do is to go and apply for and hopefully obtain planning permission while you have legal control of the land. If and hopefully when you do get planning permission granted, you can then exercise that option agreement and purchase the land at the price agreed within the contract. And on the other hand, if unfortunately planning permission gets refused, then of course with the option agreement, you only have the option, you don't have the obligation to buy the property or the land, so you can just walk away from the deal. And before I talk about how to actually calculate what land is worth and therefore what you can actually offer the landowner, it's important you understand the planning principles that determine whether a parcel of land actually has precedent for planning and whether or not it is a viable development opportunity. Now, unfortunately, in the UK, planning permission isn't exactly black and white, and there's no sort of checklist that if certain boxes are ticked, then land is definitely going to get planning. Now, all planning policy in the UK is essentially governed by a document called the National Planning Policy Framework, or the NPPF for short. And the NPPF is essentially a document created by the government to give guidance to local authorities and councils on how they should be developing their local plan for development and how they should be making decisions when it comes to approving or refusing planning applications. And so if you do find yourself with an hour or two spare, I do highly recommend reading the National Planning Policy Framework. But we've also come up with what we call 5 basic planning permission principles. Now, these principles are not an exact science, but they act as a guide to help you figure out whether a piece of land is a viable development opportunity and does have precedent for planning. And of course, these planning principles are a part of a much longer and more detailed training. But the first planning principle is that sites falling within a built-up boundary will get approval subject to the scheme being sustainable. The second principle is replacement dwellings. Replacement dwellings meaning if there is a property there already, that property can be replaced with a new dwelling, of course subject to certain parameters. Thirdly is brownfield sites. Now, brownfield sites are simply land or buildings that are now derelict or unused. And with these brownfield sites, councils are very often happy to support them for redevelopment. And number 4, properties with long gardens in built-up developments will often allow for properties to be built in those gardens at the rear of the existing property. And lastly, infill sites. Infill sites are typically empty plots of land in between existing buildings, where by developing in that infill site, you're essentially just closing the gap in that ribbon of development. Okay, so at this point, we've looked at how do you actually go about finding deals, how do you actually go about identifying whether or not it is a viable development opportunity, and thirdly, how to actually approach landowners and the deal structure, i.e. the use of an option agreement to secure the land and take it through planning. Now, as well as these planning principles, there are also some due diligence and site checks you'll need to do in order to establish whether this parcel of land is actually a viable development opportunity. Because although it may have precedent to get planning in line with national planning law, it doesn't necessarily mean it's still viable. And so these site checks and due diligence will allow you to establish exactly that. whether or not this land is still viable and worth pursuing. The first of these site checks is access. Is there adequate access to the land? Whatever you're going to build on this land, are cars and pedestrians going to be able to actually access the site, i.e. is the access wide enough, or is there any ransom strips in the way? Ransom strips being pieces of land owned by somebody else that get in the way of the road and the land you're trying to build on. The title register, is it a clean title register, or are there some restrictions, some covenants, or is it also an option agreement from another developer already on the land? If there is, this may obviously affect how far you can progress negotiations with this landowner. And thirdly is the planning history of the land. Is there a history of planning applications that have been refused in the past? If there is, of course, this is going to give you an indication as to what is and isn't possible on the land. Flood zones is another one. You need to establish whether or not the site is in a flood zone. Of course, if it is in a flood zone, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't build there. It just means you're going to have to think about this when it comes to designing your scheme and figuring out the construction methods. And then also listed buildings. Are there any buildings on the land that are listed by Heritage England, maybe as a grade 1 listed building or a grade 2 listed building? Or are there any listed buildings in the immediate vicinity that will be affected by the development on the land you're looking at? Also is conservation areas and greenbelt. Does this land fall into greenbelt and conservation areas? Again, if it does, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't develop on the land. It's just something you're going to have to take into account when coming up with your planning strategy. And also tree preservation orders. Are there any trees on the land that are preserved by the council? Now, TPOs mean you can't cut down these trees, and so depending where they are on the site, that's also going to determine how you can go about designing the scheme. And then lastly is contamination and asbestos. Is the land contaminated for whatever reason? For example, if it was an old petrol station many decades ago, there's going to be fuel pumps in the ground, and that means the land is going to be contaminated. And asbestos, of course, asbestos is material that was used in the construction of industrial buildings pre-2000. And again, if asbestos is present, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an opportunity for development. It's just something you're going to have to take into account when running your financial appraisal, because there's going to be a cost associated with the removal of the asbestos. And so really, at this point in the video, you understand how to actually go about finding development opportunities, how to actually establish whether or not they are a viable opportunity worth pursuing, and thirdly, how to actually approach the landowner and hopefully enter negotiations. And so this leads on to the next question, which is how do you actually figure out what that land is worth? And then how do you actually calculate what your offer is and what you can afford to offer the landowners? And so really the first step is figuring out what the residual land value of the land is going to be. The residual land value is basically the value of the land after you've taken into account what the end value of the development is going to be, i.e. the gross development value. You've taken away all of the costs. You've looked at what your profit margin needs to be, which is between 20 and 24, 25%. And that's going to tell you what that land is worth. Now, of course, in order to figure out your residual land value, you first need to figure out what it is you can actually build on the land. Now, again, it's impossible to predict exactly what you're going to get planning for. But of course, having an understanding of design principles and how a site can be designed, you can use tools like ProMap to come up with an approximate scheme which you can work from. You can also speak to architects or planning consultants to get an idea. But really, when it comes to making your offer, you can make your offer on a pro rata basis, i.e. the number of units you get approved for planning or the total square foot of property you get planning for, as a way to reduce your risk. And so once you've figured out your GDV, of course, there are a lot of other things that make up a financial appraisal. Now, you may have heard of the a third rule, which is this age-old myth that when calculating the land value, you take the GDV, and a third of that is going to be the profit, a third of that is going to be the build costs, and then a third of that is the value of the land. Unfortunately, as much as I wish it was that simple, it's just not true. A financial appraisal is much more complex, and every site is going to be different. So once you've established your GDV, in order to run a financial appraisal, the other costs that are associated with development is, of course, your planning costs. and the money that's going to cost you to get planning, your abnormals, so if there's any demolition that's required or there's any asbestos that needs to get removed, for example, your professional fees, and of course that's going to be your engineers, your architects, your quantity surveyors, etc. You have your construction costs, of course, which is going to be the cost of actual construction, and as well as that you're going to have your contingency, and then lastly you're going to have your sales costs and your funding costs. And so once you've run a financial appraisal, you're then going to know what your residual land value is. And so the residual land value is what the land is going to be worth with planning. And currently, if you're negotiating with a landowner where the land doesn't have planning, you're going to want to make an offer below what the residual land value is, because the difference between that residual land value and the price you're paying for the land is going to be the profit that you make from achieving planning permission. Now, when you're negotiating your offer with the landowner and the price you want to enter the option agreement at, that land without planning is worth substantially less. And so you want to be offering more than what the land is worth as is without planning in order to create a win-win scenario with the landowner, because right now their land without planning isn't worth much. You're going to take on the risk of planning. You're going to invest time, money, and effort into achieving that planning. And so if that risk pays off, you should be rewarded, but also the landowner has an incentive to enter that agreement with you because they're going to be able to sell the land more than what it's worth as is without the planning. Now, of course, there are many other creative ways to structure deals with landowners, but that is a conversation for another time. And so hopefully this lesson has given you a good insight into how to find and identify development opportunities. Because when you source your deals this way, whether it's off market and there's little competition from other developers, you can agree to buy the land at much better prices. You can make a profit in the planning, which of course is going to increase your overall development profit margin, making it substantially easier to raise finance from banks, making it a more attractive opportunity for investors because of the reduced risk. And of course, the development is just going to be more fun because one mistake isn't going to cripple the deal. You're going to have healthy margins. You're not going to have to be counting every single penny. You're not going to spend the next 12, 18 months, 2 years of your life doing a development that is causing you loads and loads of stress. So that's all for this lesson. I'll see you guys on the next one.